What's up guys, welcome to the 14th tutorial in our Python language basics. Here we're going to start a new topic of conditionals. We're going to learn what they are and how we can use them to add logic in our code. As per usual, with a brand new topic, we're just going to spend some time in the slides in the next few sections, then we can turn to the code for some concrete examples. We're going to start by covering what are conditionals. Then we can move to the simplest form, which will be if statements. There's some variants on these, such as the else if, or elif for short, and the else statements, we'll cover those, and then we'll take a look at some specific variants that we can perform on if statements that will allow us to test complex conditions, such as testing multiple things at once, nested if statements, so on and so forth. First up, we have what are conditionals. Well, conditionals are just a way to add logic into our code. If you've ever heard the term control flow, that is basically the same thing. Conditionals and control flow will be kind of used interchangeably throughout these next few sections. Conditionals allow us to choose which parts of our code we want to execute based on the outcome of certain tests. Typically, these tests are testing the state of the program. So the state of the program is basically just what the values of variables are. Depending on what task we're trying to achieve, we can poll a certain state. So test to see what state a certain part of the program is in, and then we can choose which code we want to execute or how the program should behave based on that. Now, these tests can be very simple or they can be complex, depending on, again, what we need to do. Usually, they're just going to be testing some variable values. So this is, again, the state of the program. It could be comparing multiple variables, could be testing the value of a single variable, or just maybe a Boolean variable. But either way, these are going to return true or false. Okay? Now, the simplest form of this is going to be your basic if statement. An if statement will execute some code if a test evaluates to true. So that means if that test does not evaluate to true, if it returns false, then we'll basically do nothing. Okay? Now, a very simple example of this would be maybe like a button press. Whenever you press a button on your phone or on screen, there will be some logic there to handle where you pressed on the screen, test to see if it's over a button. If it is over a button, if you press it, then it will execute some code. Okay? If you press anywhere else on the screen and it's not on the button, then we'll not do anything. Now, this test could be maybe checking the value of a Boolean variable. We'll very often see that. So if something equals true, if something equals false, so on and so forth. Or it could be testing equality between variables. Is some value greater than another? Is some variable equal to something else? So on and so forth. Next up, we have elif statements. So elif is short for else if. In fact, Python is the only language I've seen that has shortened this. Most languages say else if. But these provide extra if statements. Now, the difference between this and a regular if statement is that these come after if statements and are only executed if the previous tests fail. So it's kind of like an additional test if the previous one did not pass. These can only come after if statements, so we cannot have else if without if statements, but we can have if statements without else if statements. Okay? So this is kind of like saying, all right, if our first test fails, we need a backup test because there might be multiple states that we need to test for, and we need to provide different code or rather execute different behaviors depending on which of the few states the program can be in. We can chain together as many elif statements as we want. We can actually chain together as many if statements as we want, but having elif instead of if statements will provide slightly different behavior. We're actually going to see some examples of how those will be different in the code. Now, finally, we have else statements. These kind of provide a fail-safe. So this is saying basically, if all of the above tests fail, then we still want to execute some code rather than doing nothing. So we're going to do this. These are again only executed if the previous tests fail. If any test passes at any point in time, then it will break out of it and not bother with any of the other tests or the else statement. And these again can only come after an if statement or an else if statement. So we can have an if statement by itself, we can have an if and an else if, we can have if, else if, and else, or we can have if and else, okay? Now, the difference here is that this doesn't actually test anything. It really doesn't care about what the state of the program is in. It just says, okay, all previous tests have failed if we reach this, so we still want to execute some code that's going to be in here. Now finally we get to some if statement variants. These are just kind of some tips and tricks we can apply to make our if statements more complex, just in case we have more complex conditions that we need to take into account. We can nest if statements to add subsequent tests. We can add multiple testing conditions in if statements with the or and the and operators. This will allow us to test multiple conditions at once. So, for example, is something equal to true and is something else equal to true? If both of those are true, then we'll execute some code and so on and so forth. Finally here, we can add multiple if statements in a row without an else if to perform all of the tests. Now this will often be the case where we don't necessarily want to say, perform this test. If that fails, then we'll perform this. If that fails, then we'll perform, etc. Sometimes you want to do multiple tests in a row and execute the code regardless of the outcome of the previous tests. So that's where we would use just multiple if statements. Now, don't worry, I know this was a lot to take in all at once. If you're brand new to this topic, this is kind of the most primitive form of adding logic into your code rather than just kind of keeping track of variable values. So it's definitely an exciting topic, especially if this is kind of your first time experiencing it. Just take some time to go over what we covered here. Once you think you have a basic idea of what's going on, then you can move to the next section. We'll of course go over some code examples of each of these different cases. We'll talk about how they're different from each other and which cases, or rather in which places you would use each of these kind of tips and tricks, and we can go from there. Okay, so thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.